Welcome to Mountain Strong. Today we have come back to Little O'Malley's Peak. I wasn't thwarted this time like I was last week by a bear. Was able to make it all the way up and enjoy some of the beautiful scenery. One of the things that you'll notice in the shots from today though is that the beautiful scenery looks a bit foggy, and that's because there is a big fire burning right now in the Kenai Peninsula, and all that smoke is traveling up here and settling in the Anchorage Bowl. That combined with temperatures in the 80s makes for some very interesting hiking. We're not used to temperatures in the 80s up here in Anchorage, and so it's very hot, very smoky, and definitely a challenge, but at the same time a blessing to be able to get out and enjoy God's creation. This is a beautiful place. Today we're going to be having a look together at Psalm number 78. Let's go ahead and read that now. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation, the glorious deeds of the Lord, and His might, and the wonders that He has done. He established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers to teach their children, that the next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and arise and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and that they should not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. The Ephraimites, armed with a bow, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to His law. They forgot His works and the wonders that He had shown them. In the sight of their fathers He performed wonders. In the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan, He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime He led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock, and caused waters to flow like rivers. Yet they sinned still more against Him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rocks so that water gushed out and streams overflowed. Can He also give bread or provide meat for His people?" Therefore, when the Lord heard, He was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel, because they did not believe in God and did not trust His saving power. Yet He commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, and He rained down on them manna to eat, and gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate of the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by His power He led out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were filled, for He gave them what they craved. But before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and He killed the strongest of them, and laid low the young men of Israel. In spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite His wonders, they did not believe. So He made their days vanish like a breath, and their years in terror. When He killed them, they sought Him. They repented and sought God earnestly. They remembered that God was their rock, the Most High God their Redeemer. But they flattered Him with their mouths. They lied to Him with their tongues. Their heart was not steadfast toward Him. They were not faithful to His covenant. Yet He, being compassionate, atoned for their iniquity, and did not destroy them. He restrained His anger often, and did not stir up all His wrath. He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again. How often they rebelled against Him in the wilderness, and grieved Him in the desert. They tested God again and again, and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember His power, or the day when He redeemed them from the foe. When He performed His signs in Egypt, and His marvels in the field of Zoan, He turned their rivers to blood, so that they could not drink of their streams. He sent among them swarms of flies, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. He gave their crops to the destroying locust, and the fruit of their labor to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hail, and their sycamores with frost. He gave over their cattle to the hail, and their flocks to the thunderbolts. He let loose on them His burning anger, wrath, indignation, and distress, a company of destroying angels. He made a path for His anger. He did not spare them from death, but gave their lives over to the plague. He struck down every firstborn in Egypt, the firstfruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. Then he led his people like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them in safety so that they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. And he brought them to his holy land, to the mountain which his right hand had won. He drove out the nations before them. He appointed them for a possession and settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned away and acted treacherously like their fathers. They twisted like a deceitful bow. For they provoked him to anger with their high places. They moved him to jealousy with their idols. When God heard, he was full of wrath, and he utterly rejected Israel. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelled among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. He gave his people over to the sword and vented his wrath on his heritage. Fire devoured their young men, and their young women had no marriage song. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation. Then the Lord awoke as from a sleep, like a strong man shouting because of wine. And he put his adversaries to rout. He put them to everlasting shame. He rejected the tent of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the heavens, like the earth which he founded forever. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes he brought him to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. If you remember all the way back to verse 2 of that rather lengthy reading, you remember that the author said his intention was to declare parables, to declare dark sayings. But as you're reading through this, does anything in that reading remind you of the book of Proverbs? Does anything remind you of similitudes or likenesses? Because the word parable is not to be thought of as it was in the case of the New Testament, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's to be thought of as the word for proverb. In fact, that word is found in the book of Proverbs. But as you're reading through Psalm 78, you don't really find proverbs, you don't find any dark sayings, you find accounts of history. And you say, so what's the proverb, what's the parable, the dark saying that he intends to share? Well, the idea is clearly that history has become a parable, a proverb, a simile that no one gets, a dark saying, therefore. It's become something that in his time people don't reflect upon. God's intentions, as he sets out in those first few verses, was for history to be repeated and taught over and over again to the generation of children. But how often do children find that history is their least favorite subject? Because all they do perhaps in history is learn facts without learning the application of those facts. And I'll admit that simply learning facts is something that I don't have a lot of time for. There's not a lot of value in simply learning facts. But when we learn application, we see the value of the facts. History is meant to be studied that way. We're meant to think about and engage history with a realization that it has some bearing on the way that we live today. In this psalm, I had originally intended actually to break this psalm into 2 videos, but really what you find is a pattern that repeats twice. You find in verses 12 through 39 a description of some of the wilderness events, and in that you find God's provision, Israel's rebellion, God's punishment, and then God's mercy. Well, in verses 40 through 72, you find the same thing basically, except for the story goes from Egypt all the way to Canaan. You find God's actions of deliverance. You find Israel's ultimate rebellion in spite of those things. You find God's punishment, but then you also find God's mercy. And so when you reflect upon this, the lesson of this text, and you reflect upon the 2 different repetitions that you see in this text, there's actually 2 different conclusions. In verses 38 and 39, you learn from that first reflection upon history, you learn that my rebellion is not going to stop God from extending his mercy. You find that the conclusion of that section in verses 38 and 39 is that God is compassionate. He atones for their iniquity. He restrains his anger. He remembers that mankind is flesh. But then, as you look at the second repetition of history, or the second examination of history, it's not the exact same facts. The second examination of history following that pattern, as you come to the conclusion of all those things, you come to the realization, as those verses point out, he rejected Joseph, the tent of Ephraim, but he chose Judah. And you realize something, that even though my rebellion cannot cause God to cease to be merciful, my rebellion can cause me to miss out on God's mercy. The other tribes lost their place because they refused to accept God's mercy and because they persisted in rebellion. When you think about this recounting of history, go back to what really is a troubling reading in this text in verses 9 through 11, an occasion on which Ephraim refused to go to battle. And you say, well, what's that talking about? Well, I don't know. But it does reflect rebellion, and it reflects a rebellion that caused them to miss out on the promises of God. Because of their rebellion, they were not chosen. And again, that could be me. History teaches me that my God is faithful, and He's willing to forgive. He's willing to give me another chance. But at the same time, if I continue in rebellion, if I don't take advantage of that other chance, I don't know when my chances are going to run out. I don't know when He's going to pour out His wrath fully or when He's going to restrain it. You see, in those two recountings of history, didn't you notice how there were times when He didn't let all of His wrath out and there were times when He let His wrath out fully? I don't know when that is, but I don't want to find out. I don't want to be on the side of God's wrath. And so the application of this text is very clear. We need to be a people who do not allow history to become a parable, a dark saying to us. We need to be people who are constantly making the connection and using history as a parable. You know, that word, again, means a proverb or a simile, a comparison. Making continuous comparisons between ourselves and the past. We need to do that so that we learn the lessons of the past and so that we place ourselves always in the mercy of God. May God bless us to be a people who study history. May God bless us to be a people who engage history and engage our reality considering history, but also, as the text encourages, to be a people who teach history to the coming generations so that they learn the mistakes of those who've gone before them and don't repeat them. May God bless all of us to always find ourselves on the side of mercy and not on the side of rebellion. And of course, may God bless you today.